chapter 32, we're going to talk about female genital and reproductive function. So we're going to start out with this picture, and what we're looking at is a mid-sagittal cut through the pelvic cavity. And so at this mid-sagittal view, you can see a variety of structures like the urinary bladder, the uterus, and the rectum. And you can see their associated structures. So the urinary bladder has the urethra here. The uterus is associated with the vagina here, or vaginal canal, and then the rectum is associated with the anus. Now, you can see some other external genital structures too, like labia majora and labia minora. You can see where the labia meet anteriorly at something called the clitoral hood, or vulva. We see the clitoris right here, and the clitoris is analogous to corpus cavernosum in males, so it's actually made of some erectile tissue. Just near that, we see our pubic symphysis, which is just right in the midline of the pelvis there. And again, some of the pelvic organs. So these are all organs in the pelvic cavity. Now, because this is the reproductive system, we'll focus on the vaginal canal, the uterus, and uterine tube and ovary. And so with the uterus, there's several key parts. We got the fundus, which is this top curvature. We have the body, which is the center, and then the cervix, which is the neck, or the sort of, most inferior portion here. Now the cervix has an opening called the cervical os, and this opens up into the uterus. And so inside the uterus, we see that when there's not a fetus in there, it's actually in more of a collapsed state. And the uterus is made of several key tissues. We have endometrium, which is epithelial and connective tissue that lines the inside of the uterus. Then we have myometrium, which is the smooth muscle of the uterus that's going to aid in contractions during labor. And then the very outside of the uterus is the perimetrium, and it's basically a fibrous tissue that surrounds the outside of the uterus. Now, associated with the uterus, what we find is the uterine tube or fallopian tube. And the uterine tube is basically a muscular tube that has a ciliated epithelium on the inside that helps wave and waft ovulated eggs up through the tube where it's transported towards the uterus. Now, the uterus is associated with the ovary here. The ovary is the female gonad, and the ovary is actually held in place by a series of ligaments, like the ovarian ligament is right here. We also have a broad ligament going across here that helps hold the ovary and fallopian tube in position. And we call these the suspensory ligaments, so they hold all these internal reproductive organs in place. Now, the vagina here is lined with, on the inside, is lined with a stratified squamous epithelium, which is tough. We also have smooth muscle that lines the walls of the vagina, and some fibrous tissue outside of that that's also rich in elastic fibers for stretch. Now, focusing on the structure of the uterus, what we see here is that the very inferior most part of the uterus is the cervix. It's sort of this donut-shaped structure here at the end of the vaginal canal. The opening of the cervix we call the cervical os. So we have an external and an internal os, which would be deeper. This forms a cervical canal. Now, the cervical canal, it can be plugged with mucus, and that mucus that blocks the cervical canal helps prevent infection, deep within the uterus and beyond. Now, this is the body of the uterus. This is the fundus of the uterus, or top portion. And you'll see there's a lot of associated structures as well. Like this is the broad ligament that really helps hold the uterus, ovary, and fallopian tube in position. The broad ligament is one of those suspensory ligaments that you find that just kind of traverses the pelvic cavity. The ovary is held in position by the ovarian ligament right here and another suspensory ligament nearby. It's what helps hold this particular gonad in place. Now, what's associated with the ovary is the fallopian tube or uterine tube, and there's several key parts. We got the fimbriae, which is little finger-like projections on the tip. These things actually will wave and help waft an ovulated egg up inside of the fallopian tube. We have the isthmus, which is this sort of curvature here, and then just sort of the rest of the tube over here. Now, There are some associated vessels, so you can have blood vessels that supply things like the uterus and the ovary. You can see those actually within the suspensory ligaments as well. Now, when we talk about the development of the female egg, it occurs within the ovary or female gonad, similar to how in males, the development of sperm occurred within the testes or male gonad. However, with the ovary, you don't find, a system of tubules like you see in the testes. Instead, what happens is you have these stem cells called oogonium, and these oogonium are found on the cortex or the outermost layer of the ovary. They divide into what we call a primary oocyte, and this process of forming a primary oocyte actually begins before birth. So during fetal development, as the ovarian tissue is growing, primary oocytes are also developing, and this all begins before birth. Now, primary oocytes begin to divide before birth, and then they're halted at meiosis until puberty. Now, once puberty has occurred, what happens then is that these primary oocytes are allowed to continue to divide into what we call secondary oocytes. And what's interesting, though, with these cell divisions is that you get unequal cell division, where one cell gets a majority of the cytoplasm and organelles, and you get another cell that really gets just genetic material in some cytoplasm. And we call this other non-viable cell a polar body. And the function of this is that it's sort of like a sacrificial type of cell. That way you can get a one big cell that has a lot of cytoplasm, a lot of organelles that can really support, a growing embryo after fertilization. Now, the secondary oocyte is going to divide into a mature ovum, but this mature ovum only is going to occur once fertilization occurs. So once fertilization occurs, then meiosis 2 gets completed. But like our first round of meiosis, we still get polar bodies that are generated. So you end up with one really large ovum, which we see here. And the reason why it's so large is that it was a result of unequal cell division. So you get a lot of cytoplasm and a lot of organelles in one cell. In fact, these ovum here are so large they could be seen with the unaided eye. They're about 150 microns in diameter, which is approximately 1/10 of a millimeter. So 10% of the millimeter in diameter is the cell. And that's actually large enough to see with the unaided eye. I mean, granted, it would be a very small speck, but you don't need a microscope to see it. You could potentially see this because it's such a large cell. Now, this process of oocyte development occurs within the ovary, and all of these oocytes are found surrounded by a type of cell called the follicle. So these follicles surround the oocytes. We have primary, secondary, tertiary, and antral follicles that basically just grow larger and larger once puberty has begun. So we start out with these primordial follicles, which begin during fetal development. In these primordial follicles, you're going to find primary oocytes, and these primordial follicles will start to develop into primary follicles, once every 28 days or once every ovarian cycle. And these primary follicles will develop into tertiary, secondary, tertiary, and then antral follicles, which get ovulated. Now, ovulation occurs mid-cycle on day 14, and what we see here then is that under the microscope, you can see what these follicles look like. So primordial follicles are just basically a circle of very, very densely packed cells with a primary oocyte in the middle. Now, due to the stimulation of hormones like follicle-stimulating hormone, some of these primordial follicles are going to be allowed to develop into primary follicles, and then due to the presence of hormones like estrogen, these primary follicles can develop into secondary and tertiary follicles, where essentially the follicles get larger and wider and also thicker, and you also get the development of a fluid-filled antrum. This is why we call the tertiary follicle an antral follicle, also called a vesicular follicle. Now, this tertiary follicle contains the secondary oocyte, so it's almost fully developed, and this is the type of follicle that gets ovulated. So at ovulation, what happens is this follicle moves closer to the surface of the ovary, where it fuses with the cortex of the ovary, and the egg gets expelled right here. So what's expelled is the secondary oocyte. Now the secondary oocyte, after ovulation, it then could be potentially fertilized by sperm. And as you can see in this picture, ovulation occurring, they've actually captured a shot of ovulation. So it's sort of like a fluid-filled cyst that actually fuses with the cortex of the ovary, and then that fluid gets expelled out of the ovary. That way, the secondary oocyte now is actually in the pelvic cavity. Now, what's interesting then is that for the follicular cells that get left behind after ovulation, these cells actually change into a type of cell called corpus luteum. So that all of these follicular cells that get left behind after ovulation, they form a cell called corpus luteum, which means yellow body. And corpus luteum is basically a big old progesterone and estrogen secreting type of tissue that basically secretes, a tremendous amount of progesterone and estrogen to support the growth of the endometrium within the uterus, among other factors too. But the hormones that are released by corpus luteum help coordinate the activities of the uterus in order to support a potentially fertilized egg. Now, if fertilization doesn't occur, then the corpus luteum basically degrades and decays or dies into something called corpus albicans, which is basically just like scar tissue that remains in the ovary from corpus luteum. So what we see in this picture then is a little bit more detail on the uterus. And what's interesting is there's a communication then between the ovary and the uterus using hormones, where ovarian hormones like estrogen and progesterone will cause the uterus to grow or shed with normal ovarian cycles. So what happens is that once progesterone and estrogen levels get really low due to the degradation of corpus luteum, like if fertilization doesn't occur, well, the really low progesterone and estrogen levels cause the endometrium inside the uterus to shed, and that begins the menstrual cycle. Now, once those hormone levels are also very low, then new primordial follicles can develop into primary, secondary, and tertiary follicles. And as those follicles get larger and larger and larger, then estrogen levels start to increase. And it's the increasing estrogen levels that also cause a thickening or regrowth of the endometrium following the menstrual phase. Now, at day 14, you get ovulation, where the egg gets ovulated into the peritoneum here. And after ovulation, corpus luteum secretes a tremendous amount of progesterone and estrogen that also causes the endometrium inside the uterus to grow even thicker. It also causes cervical mucus to thicken as well. And what's interesting too is that after ovulation, the fimbriae here start to wave and they help waft that secondary oocyte up into the uterine tube. And then there's cilia in here that actually help transport that oocyte or ovum towards the uterus. And usually fertilization occurs within the uterine tube itself. So in terms of some of the external structures, we see in this view basically an inferior view of the pelvis. So we see some external genital structures here. Up here we find a fatty pad called mons pubis, which literally means pubic mountain. It's basically just an aggregation of adipose that sits right on top of the pubic symphysis. Just inferior to that, all of this tissue on the outside, which is keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, that's also hairy skin. We call this labia majora. And then medial to that, what we find is labia minora, which is a non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. And with the labia meet, they form this clitoral hood, and that has the clitoris here. Now, the clitoris is analogous to the male penis because it's made of erectile tissue. So during sexual excitement, the clitoris will engorge with blood, and it's also a more sensitive structure, an external genitalia. Now, inside of labia minora, we also find this vestibular bulb. The bulb of the vestibule here is also some erectile tissue that will engorge with blood during sexual excitement. This one's analogous to corpus spongiosum. And then what's nearby the vaginal orifice is what we call a greater vestibular gland, which is very similar to the bulbal urethral gland. And basically the greater vestibular gland makes a secretion that helps lubricate the vaginal orifice here during sexual arousal. The vaginal entrance here is actually what will lead into the vaginal canal, which then if you keep going more superiorly, then that will lead to the cervix. And then the distance between the external genitalia and the anus, this is all the perineum nearby. Now, in terms of the structure of the breast, it turns out that breast tissue is actually mostly made of adipose. So you see a lot of this yellowish tissue is is adipose tissue. Now, the breast is also supported by a lot of suspensory ligaments, and these suspensory ligaments basically help anchor the breast to the underlying muscle, like your pectoralis major. Now, if you look more anterior on the breast, what we find then is you're going to see a lot of the mammary glandular tissue. So this glandular tissue has big lobes, and these lobes are divided into lobules, and each of these lobules has basically an epithelium. It's an exocrine gland, and it's a modified sweat gland that drains into a duct where all these ducts then drain basically breast milk, which is modified sweat, into a main duct here that then drains at the level of the nipple. Now, breast milk production is actually going to be stimulated by oxytocin, and oxytocin is what stimulates breast milk production, and then prolactin is what stimulates lactation or milk letdown. Now, near the nipple, we have the areola, which is basically just some keratinized stratified squamous epithelium that surrounds this nipple. And one thing that's important to note to you guys is that the breast is also just a lot of loose tissue because it's mostly made of adipose. So when we talk about breast cancer in future chapters, keep this in mind because because the breast isn't surrounded by a thick fibrous capsule, what you see then is that cancers of the breast tissue then are more able to spread more easily because the tissue is more loose, and it can end up into the lymphatic and bloodstream more easily because it's not encased in a thick fibrous capsule. Now, what this slide is showing is actually going to be coordination of the ovary due to hormonal factors. So just like the male system, it all starts with the hypothalamus. So remember, in males, the hypothalamus releases GnRH, just like in females. So you have gonadotropin releasing hormone. Now this gonadotropin releasing hormone travels in the bloodstream towards the anterior portion of the pituitary gland, where it can stimulate glandular cells in the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH. Now, FSH is called follicle stimulating hormone, and as the name implies, it actually stimulates the development of follicles. Luteinizing hormone, or LH, is released in tremendous amounts at ovulation, but we'll talk about that here in a minute. But one thing that's important to note is that at puberty, there's a tremendous amount of GnRH that's produced. And this release of GnRH stimulates the production of FSH and LH. And once you get enough FSH, then this follicle stimulating hormone can travel through the bloodstream and stimulate the development of follicles so that primordial follicles can now start to develop into primary follicles. And as these primary follicles start to develop, you see that these follicular cells start to secrete things like estrogen. Now, what's interesting here is that the estrogen that's released early on during follicle development actually inhibits the secretion of LH. Now, estrogen that's released has different effects. Like for one, it stimulates the growth of endometrium within the uterus. It stimulates the growth of accessory glands and organs. It actually determines like sex drive in females. Stimulates bone and muscle growth, as well as has different effects on the central nervous system because your brain has a lot of estrogen receptors throughout it. Now, what's interesting too is that estrogen also stimulates the secretion of progesterone, and this progesterone helps basically stimulate growth of the endometrium as well. Now, as these follicles start to grow larger and larger and larger, at high concentrations, estrogen after day 10 actually has a stimulatory effect on luteinizing hormone. So once you get enough estrogen, because the follicles have grown large enough, then estrogen actually stimulates the release of luteinizing hormone. And so when luteinizing hormone's in highest concentration at day 14 or mid-cycle, luteinizing hormone then actually helps stimulate ovulation. And when ovulation occurs, that you get this LH surge due to the stimulation due to estrogen. And after ovulation, the follicle that was releasing estrogen then turns into corpus luteum, and that starts secreting a tremendous amount of progesterone. So we can see this process on this slide. And on the slide, what we're seeing is basically the relationship of FSH and LH hormonal levels to the process of follicular development, to ovarian hormone levels, to basically the growth of the endometrium, as well as body temperature. So what I like to start with first is just talking about the beginning. You just got to pick a starting point because it's a cycle. But we'll pick, day 0, which is the beginning of the menstrual phase. Now, at the beginning of the menstrual phase, what we see is that estrogen levels are really low, and progesterone levels are also really low because corpus luteum degraded into corpus albicans. Now, once estrogen levels get really low and progesterone levels are low, then you start to see rises in FSH and LH, where follicle stimulating hormone released by the pituitary gland starts to stimulate the development of a new follicle. Right? Primordial follicles can then develop into primary, secondary, and then tertiary follicles. And as these follicles start to grow larger, they start to release more and more estrogen. Now, when estrogen levels are fairly low, we see it has an inhibitory effect on luteinizing hormone. Later on during follicular development, once estrogen levels get high because the follicles are getting larger, estrogen actually then has an excitatory effect on the pituitary gland. It actually stimulates the release of luteinizing hormone. So right at mid-cycle, day 14, we get this big old spike in luteinizing hormone, which we call the LH surge. And this luteinizing hormone surge is what stimulates ovulation. So at ovulation, then, what happens is the ovum gets expelled from the ovary, and the follicular cells that are left behind in the ovary then turn into corpus luteum. And this corpus luteum then starts to secrete a lot of progesterone, which is why we see progesterone levels rising dramatically, as well as some estrogen. Now, progesterone being released from corpus luteum supports the growth of our endometrium. So you can see that the endometrium starts to get thicker and thicker, as well as you start to see that blood vessels grow. You get a lot of more uterine glands as well that can all help support a potentially fertilized egg. And this will continue to occur over the next 2 weeks. However, if fertilization doesn't occur in that 2-week period, this corpus luteum then will degrade into corpus albicans. And once corpus luteum degrades into corpus albicans, progesterone levels fall dramatically because then it stops releasing progesterone. Estrogen levels also fall very dramatically, and that due to a decrease in progesterone and estrogen levels, then we see the shedding of the endometrium. And we've actually just gone full cycle because that's where we started. So once progesterone and estrogen levels get low, the endometrium sheds. That begins the beginning of the menstrual phase. But because estrogen and progesterone levels are low, follicle stimulating hormone is also starting to increase and also developing a new follicle. And the whole process repeats.